Good morning, everyone. So let's continue our discussion for your subject in mind, which is ethics. We've already discussed the relationship or the definition of ethics or the introduction of ethics, particularly on the fundamental of it. We've already discussed the relationship of ethics to other field of sciences, and we also discuss the phases or the morality that is related to other phases in life. So this was our last topic, right? So now let's move forward to lesson 3. Lesson 3, I'm sorry, it is just a error. We are now in lesson 3. So let's focus on the fundamental concept of morality. But before that, let's define first what is morality. As we all know, morality refers to that quality of goodness or badness in a human act. So meaning to say, when we say morality is not only by the word imagine, it is always supposed to be found in human acts. And in your human action there is two subunits or division. In a human action, you are divided into your good thing or to your bad thing. So that makes your morality. For example, every day we pass judgment on the morality of our human action. Meaning to say, when we ask a question, what he did was right or what he did was wrong, he behaved well, he should not have done it, he is not morally justified in doing the act. Basically, those questions that I've already read, that I've already tell to you, shows that there is the fundamental and objective distinction of right and wrong, which we call a moral in human action. Meaning to say, those questions that arises can be identified or can be used as a gap if we can literally know the distinction of right and wrong. And by knowing the distinction of right and wrong, we can call it as your moral in your human action. While there's difference in opinion as to the nature of morality. Meaning to say, all are agreed that there are some action that are good and some action that are bad. So that's why morality can be identified with the moral goodness or the moral badness of a person. And that badness and goodness of a person can be identified by the means of the human action. All of action that can be done in humans can be identified or can be identified by goodness and badness. So with that, of course, human action can be lead to what or can be led to norm of morality or normative of morality. Meaning to say, right and wrong, good or bad, even high or low, or even just and unjust is actually a basis or a standard or even a rule or principle of law by which we can distinguish from the other. In the case of human action, the basis of the distinction between right and wrong is called normative of morality or norm of morality. Meaning to say, when we say norm, it is usually be done. Okay, it is usually na sasanayan na natin or nangyayari na siya. That's why we can identify the basis of distinction to or by the norm of morality. By the norm of morality, we mean therefore, number one, the standard of right and wrong in human acts. So what are those standard of right and wrong? Meaning to say, these are signifies the action of the person. That standard can actually identify by your human acts. It's either right or wrong. It's depend on the action that you've been done. Number two, the reason why certain acts are morally right and why certain acts are wrong. So meaning to say, normative of morality or the distinction between right and wrong can be signified only in your human action. Okay? And by that human action, there are actually particular action by each individual. So literally, to understand it more, let's discuss human acts. So ethics deals with the study of man and particularly with his action. But not every act which proceeds from man is a human act. as used and understood in ethics. So meaning to say, these are the lineup on how thus human acts can be identified through ethics. We mean that human acts is a free voluntary acts. So meaning to say, human acts is not, it's not plan. It is a free voluntary. It's actually can be done by a person. Number two, it acts done with knowledge and consent. Of course, your human acts can be done by yourself and by the knowledge and of course the consent. That's why in my previous topic I've already tell you the example of acts that can that have knowledge and consent. It's not only about thinking process, but hence it also be focused also with how you deal with the consent, right? Okay. Number three, acts which are proper to man as man because of all animals he alone has the knowledge and freedom of will. Meaning to say, your acts can be done also based on the interaction between the other person to the environment itself. So meaning to say, you will be acting properly when you are interacting to another person, because as we all know, humans in all organism or in all living organism here in the earth or in the universe, we are knowledgeable and we know our freedom of will. Okay, so that what number three wants to tell us. Okay, number four, acts which we are conscious or under our control and for which we are responsible. Of course, because from the word itself, consciousness, it is much more particularly on the awareness of the person. So meaning to say, if we are aware, we can control and we are responsible to our action. And number five, human acts are those of which man is master, which he has the power of doing or not doing as he please. Okay, very actually, it's very understandable that if we are pertaining to human acts, we hold that one. So meaning to say, the responsibility of the action is the human being. You know what you've done, if it is good or bad, and you know what you've done, if it is bad or good. Okay, so that means the five aspect pertaining human action. So meaning to say, acts therefore in order to be truly human must be done not knowingly and willfully. Without knowledge and consent, there can be no human act. Okay, so just to be more specific about this statement, meaning to say, human acts should be have moral significance. Okay, it should have or it is very important for you to know the action that you've done. Okay, the action that you've done, that it is morally correct or morally right or morally wrong. Okay, and after we've already discussed the human acts or the aspects pertaining to human acts, of course, in your human action, there is signifies the voluntariness and your responsibility. So the fundamental concept of ethics is human acts. In human acts, you should have responsibility, reward, or punishment. It is actually intimately related to each other. All of this concept basically identify or explain the freedom of choice in man or the so-called voluntariness. So we have at least five lists of a good example of voluntariness and responsibility. Number one, relation between voluntariness and ethics. So what does it mean? Meaning to say, ethics studies human acts, and human acts to be human must be voluntary. So meaning to say, since ethics is all about human action, the human action must be voluntary. Okay? What do you mean by voluntary? It's already been done, you know how to control it, you know what you've already done, you know if it is right or wrong because it is voluntary. Okay? Number two, between morality and voluntariness. So, what does it mean? Meaning to say, only voluntary acts have a moral bearing. Okay? It is absurd and silly to speak of the morality of dogs, stones, or horses, precisely because they do not have a freedom of choice in their action. Going back to what I've said a while ago, that we as a human is actually responsible of everything because we know the freedom of will. So here in number 2, between morality and voluntariness, we can only act voluntary if we are actually humans, because if we're trying to figure out the morality between dogs and stones or even other animals, we cannot actually identify or explain it further because there is no such thing called freedom of will between those animals. So here, morality can be identified by the means of human acts that can be done by human. Okay, and number 3, we have human act and voluntariness. What does it mean? We have shown that human acts are the free acts of man. Going back to number 2, that's why it's called voluntariness, because human action is basically connected to our free will or the free acts of the man. Number 4, responsibility and voluntariness. What does it mean? There can be responsibility only if there is knowledge and consent. And consent means voluntariness. So meaning to say, the responsibility occurs when you are knowledgeable and you get consent to the individual that you've show your action. So meaning to say, a consent itself or the word consent itself is can be leading with the word voluntariness. Okay? Because as I've said, human action or acts should be done with knowledge and a consent. So literally, if you're having interaction with the person, it is not only sharing with knowledge or sharing with ideas to them, but also if you are having or consulting something, you have to get the consent first before doing the action. Okay? And lastly, we have number 5, we have punishment. Okay? Punishment, literally by the word itself, it's very absurd and most cruel to punish anyone who acted because of pure necessity for doing what he could not do otherwise. Unless there is voluntariness, there can be no responsibility, and without responsibility, punishment is meaningless. So meaning to say, it is very hard to punish a person if there's no voluntariness. Why? Because if there's no voluntariness, there is no consent. Diba? Because as I've said, consent means voluntariness. So meaning to say, if you are not responsible enough to a certain action, we cannot deal with the so-called punishment. It's very hard to punish a person that you didn't know if you are accountable to the certain action. So meaning to say, you have to know if you are accountable to that action, then that's the time you will punish the person. Okay? Or if you are involved to a certain situation, and that's the time that you will punish the person, or that's the time that you will have the punishment. And all such thing, from voluntariness and responsibility, this notion is most basic and inseparable from ethics if we're trying to explain what foregoing concept of ethics. We see the clear distinction between concept immoral and amoral, between moral and normal, and between perversity and peculiarity. So to discuss it more, we also have this so-called a notion of voluntariness, and this particularly or explained by these 3 concepts. Number 1, moral. When we say moral, it is actually contradictory of, or immoral, sorry. Immoral is the contradictory of moral. What does it mean? It means contrary to or violated of the rules of right conduct. So meaning to say, immoral is your action that is actually against the law or against the person. You are doing the action without consent. Okay? That is immoral. Then if we connect to the word amoral, amoral means morally indifferent. Why? Amoral is your action that is actually shows neither good nor bad in itself. So meaning to say, when we're trying to figure out what is amoral, meaning to say it's neither, it's between goodness or badness. If we're trying to compare it to immoral will state that the badness of the person. Kaya nga sinabi, it is an action that been done against the law or against the person, because you are not having a concept with that. Okay? So that is the connection between immoral and amoral. Number 2, we have moral. Moral is distinguished actually from normal in that the latter refers to physical or psychological standard and has no reference to moral rectitude. So meaning to say, when we're trying to tell the moral, of course, if it is reflect to the moral goodness of a person. That's why I've said a while ago that if we're trying to identify the moral, it is basically or it is distinguished from normal. Why? Because it is usually can be identified physically or psychological standard, and of course it has no reference to moral rectitude or correct rectitude. So moral is particularly on the on the goodness of the person. And if we're trying to figure out what is perfectly normal person, it uh it can be actually even the moral, let me correct my word, even if in the word perfectly normal person, they can be very immoral in their life, whereas an abnormal person can be very moral in his acts and live in accordance with the moral law. What does it mean? So meaning to say, some of the person that is actually normal are basically those person can that act badness, while those abnormal always act what? Goodness. Even if we know that it is goodness, it will even if we know that it is badness, it will reflect to goodness pa rin. Bakit? Like for example, those persons that there's disability with mentally, di ba, they do not know what is good and right. So even if they commit bad, hindi natin sila kayang or hindi natin sila papatawan ng isang case kasi hindi nila alam kung ano ang mali at tama. Pero itong perfect human or perfect normal person, some or most of them usually acts badness or usually know their action. So kaysa sa abnormal and normal, if we're literally to compare it, mas maraming kasalanan yung perfectly normal person than the abnormal person. Kasi tayong mga perfectly normal person, we know already the bad and good thing. While the abnormal person, they don't know how to identify the goodness and the badness of the person. Okay? So, not only that, we also have the number 3 of the notion, involuntariness. We have peculiarity and perversity. What does it mean? Actually, peculiarity is actually concerning on actually, peculiarity and perversity is very different to one another, but they are the same if we're trying to figure out or if we're trying to connect it to abnormality and immorality. Why? If we're trying to define what is perversity, perversity always involve moral rectitude or responsibility. When we say moral rectitude, the correct behavior of a person, meaning to say if it is correct, meaning it is the person is accountable. The person know what he or she doing. So meaning to say he or she responsible on what he doing. Thus the peculiarity does not involve with what? With moral rectitude or responsibility. Kabaliktaran niya. In peculiarity, you are not responsible on what you are doing. That's why I've said that it is like a abnormality and immorality, because in abnormality, if you are an abnormal person, you are peculiarity. Because why? Because you did not know you did not know what is the good and bad of the situation. You are not accountable. You are not responsible with your what they call this, with your action, because you are abnormal person. While if you're trying to act immorally, that's the thing. That's the difference. Why? Because a normal person act immoral, meaning to say you know your action, meaning to say you are accountable or you are responsible with your action. Okay? I think that's the three notion of voluntariness: the immoral and amoral, the moral and perfectly normal person, the peculiarity and perversity. So now let's move forward to the further study on voluntariness. Okay? So here we have actually the perfect and imperfect voluntariness and imperfect voluntariness, the direct voluntary act and indirect voluntary act. But before that, the concept of voluntariness is extremely important in ethics because number one, these are the reason. One, as we have just explained, ethics deals precisely with the study of human acts. So meaning to say, we are dealing with voluntary acts of a man. Next, it is the amount or degree of voluntariness present in an act, which determines the amount or degree of responsibility, and this in turn will determine the amount of punishment, if any, to be meted out. Meaning to say, in the second reason or importance of the concept of voluntariness, that voluntariness itself is presented by the action, and the action can be done by the human, and thus the human can be accountable or responsible in that action. If the human is accountable and responsible with her or his action, meaning to say, that's the time you will what do you call this, know the degree of punishment that you will be allotted for a certain person. Kasi if there's a responsible or accountability, there is a punishment to be involved. Hence, these are actually the order or inquiries into nature of voluntariness. It actually distinguished by where? Perfect voluntariness and imperfect voluntariness. So what does it mean? So the first comes with full knowledge and full consent. So meaning to say, when we're trying to figure out what is perfect voluntariness, it defines as the full knowledge and full consent. While if we're trying to figure out with imperfect voluntariness, this defined as no perfect knowledge, no nor consent, or when either or both of knowledge or consent is partial. So meaning to say, the difference between perfect and imperfect: perfect is you have full knowledge and you are accountable because you have consent with that, with your action. While imperfect, you are not accountable because there's no perfect knowledge or nor consent that you've done in your certain action. And not only that, it can also be distinguished also by direct voluntary act and indirect voluntary act. An act is directly voluntary, or in Greek, when we say directly voluntary, it is also called as voluntary in se, S-E. Okay? When the act is intended for its own sake, so meaning to say you are literally depending your action by yourself, either as a means or as an end. So meaning to say, in this directly voluntary, sino lang ang iniintindi mo? Sarili mo. For example, he who intends to go to party in order to drink with friends will both the going to the party and drinking with friends, both acts therefore are directly voluntary. Why? Why it is directly voluntary? Why? Bakit? Kasi both both you and your friends decided to go to the party. You are actually showing voluntariness. Dalawa kayo, yung friends mo at ikaw, pupunta sa isang party. It's like a plan. So meaning to say, your action is voluntary. Hence, it's very what they call this, different to indirect voluntary act. Why? Because indirect voluntary act are also called in Greek voluntary in causa, meaning to say expelling INCAUSA. So when we say indirect in Greek, it is in causa. Okay? So what is in this voluntary? Meaning to say, it is an act which is not intended for its own sake. Meaning to say, you are not literally mining your own, but which merely follows as a regrettable consequence of an action directly willed. Okay, what are those examples? Going to the party to enjoy with friends but making trouble when drunk. The making of trouble may have been foreseen and foreknown, but it may not have been intended, in which case the act of making trouble is only indirectly voluntary. So meaning to say, in going to the party, you are actually we already know that if you're going to the party, there are certain limitation. But in going to the party, there are, diba, there are alcohols or drinks. So you intended to party like that, then napaaway ka. Then after napaaway ka, nag-away talaga kayo, your action is indirectly voluntary because your first plan is to go to party to have some fun, not do this kind of immoral aspect. But since partying or party has a connected to immoral or connected to a situation or area na hindi talaga makakaligtaan na mag-away-away because of the alcohol itself, the degree of alcohol in the body of the person, hindi natin malalaman kung anong mangyayari sa loob. Kaya siya indirectly voluntary kasi that's not your plan. Okay? Anymore. You go to the party to have some fun, not to get some trouble. But you get some trouble, meaning to say when you making trouble, that is indirectly voluntary. Okay. Here, another good example. The unintended killing of non-combatant ants as a result of the bombing of military objective. What does it mean? Meaning to say, here, it is involuntary act because unintended, meaning to say you did not intended to do the action. So that's why it's called involuntary. But if you intended to do the action, you plan with your action, that means you are showing voluntariness or direct voluntariness. But if you're showing what? But if you're showing or if your action is unintended or it is not intended to do that one, your action is involuntary action or involuntary act. Okay? So that is the study pertaining to voluntary action. Okay? So to proceed with our discussion, there's a certain actually question, why is an indirect voluntary act still voluntary when it is not intended and follows only as regrettable side issue? That's correct. Kasi some of indirect voluntary, we did not know that it's indirect voluntary. We didn't know that our action is not intended. Diba? Usually, our action is not intended or not indirect voluntary. Bakit ganon? Papaano? So the answer is that when we will to do an act, we will the whole act including its consequences. And since we place the cause, we also indirectly will the effect. Although this is in itself regrettable, we are therefore responsible for the consequences of our action, even these are not intended. So meaning to say, like for example involuntary action. Even if you study very well, in the examination you did not get a high grade, meaning to say that is your involuntary act. Meaning to say your action is not intended because you really didn't understand the lesson or the topic. Okay? And we are accountable with that. Kaya nga sabi dito na ang regrettable, hindi sa impact ng iba, kundi sa'yo. Kasi kahit nag-study ka, pero hindi mo naintindihan, that is the regrettable of your action will be bounced back to you. Ikaw lang. Anong mangyayari? Mababa ka sa exam. Mababagsak ka, if ever. So that is intended voluntary act. Hindi mo alam na you are not intended to do that one kasi you did not actually, you actually study pero wala talagang pumapasok sa utak. So that is intended action or intended that is indirect voluntary action. Okay? So what do you mean by that? In Greek, it is called kausa, kauses, ithiam, kausa, kausati. What does it mean? It means the cause of the cause is also the cause of the thing caused. So Meaning to say that in the series of the sentence, the cause of the cause is also the cause of the thing cause. Cause with ed ha, meaning to say in a series of cause with ed, it causes the first cause is the true cause. Meaning to say the cause or the root of the cause is your first cause. Okay? Okay. For example, if in a line of cars, say A, B, and C were bumped by another car D, and as a consequence, each car bumped the car next to it. And as further result, the last car C hits a pedestrian, killing him. Then the cause of the death of the pedestrian is the driver of car D. What do you think is the root or the cause of all cause? So as I've said a while ago, in a series of cause, the first cause is the true cause. So if we are lining the cars from A, B, and C were bumped by another car D, the cause of it is from the first cause, which is the lining of A, B, and C. When the A, B, and C bump to the car D, that's the time there is consequences. So meaning to say, the first cause is the lining of the cars A, B, and C. Because of the lining of the cars A, B, and C, that's the time they bump to the car D, that's the time they have or face consequences. So meaning to say, with the Greek word causa, causae es ethiam cause, causa causati, the cause will be the cause or the past tense. It's already been done. So the reason of the cause is basically can be identified in the first cause. Kung ano yung una mong dahilan. Ang una mong dahilan ay yung paglinya ng tatlong cars. Sa paglinya ng tatlong cars, A, B, C, bump or nabangga ang car ni letter D. So that's the time na in the situation, ano yung first cause? Yung paglilinya ng A, B, and C, or yung paglilinya ng car ni A, B, and C. Okay? So that was what we're trying to tell about this kind of statement. Okay. So meaning, in the cause, you will be trying to figure out the root of it, the main cause, the main reason. Okay? So let's move forward now to the, what they call this? Let's move forward now to the moral principle involved in action having two effects. But before that, there's questions that arises also. Diba? In immorality, there is a difficult question sometimes arises as to whether it would be morally right to do certain action from which good as well as bad effects follow. For example, makinig, should a man be restrained from saving his honor because the reputation of a high government official will be destroyed from disclosure he has to make in his defense? Was it morally right to drop the atomic bomb which would shorten the war, but which would destroy thousands and thousands of innocent lives? Is it morally right to do an act which entails bad as well as good consequence? So, in that question, the answer is yes. But with the following condition. Number 1, you can have or you can decide your decision in identifying the right and wrong basically on this or on the following. The action itself should be good or at least morally indifferent. Okay? So you have to depend your decision if it is good. It's not only good for you, but also it's good to others. The evil effect should not be directly intended, but morally allowed to happen as regrettable side issue. So, we cannot tell that our decision, or we cannot tell by that decision there's no badness. So, if there's a badness, dapat it's not directly intended. So, meaning to say, you are having involuntary act. by having the involuntary act, of course, you have consequences. That consequences or the regrettable is by your own self. Ikaw lang. It is not bounced back to the other person. Number 3, there should be a reason sufficiently grave in doing the act. So meaning to say, in doing the decision, you have to know first the reason before you act. Okay? Then lastly, that the evil effect should not outweigh the good effect. So meaning to say, in the totality of your decision making or in the totality of this answering this question, yung atomic bomb, be sure that the badness doing is not outweigh your goodness. So even if you did not know that this is the right thing to do, pero the main goal mo lang is yung goodness, hindi siya dapat maaapawan ng badness kasi in doing an action, hindi natin what do you call this, ma-weigh kung if our action can be bad or good. If it is, di ba, may sometimes good sa atin pero bad sa kanila. So ganyan yon. This is what the statement wants to tell us. Okay? So there are a condition, to be exact. Sabi nga dito, the moral principle involved in action having two effects. So these are the condition. First, the condition requires that act be good in itself. What does it mean? It means that the reason for this is that if the act itself is bad, then we would be doing evil that good may come from it. So meaning to say, if the action is bad, so literally the action is evil. If the action is good, literally the action is goodness. That actually involved to the saying, the end does not justify the means. We should not employ bad means even in order to attain a good end. So meaning to say, in the statement, the end does not justify the mean, we will not employ bad doings in order to attain good end. Like for example, yung sinabi ko sa inyo, nagnakaw ako kasi gusto kong bumili ng gamot ng nanay ko. Even if that's the reason of it, even if it is a good end, you have done what? Badness. Okay? So, aside from that, we may not do evil that good may result. So, if there's evilness, always the result will be evil, not good. Okay? So, as an impact to the society, it's still evil. Even if your main reason is to get some medicine of your mom, diba? Even if you know that it is good to your mom, but the bounce back of the action is still evil. Okay? So, number 2 action or number 2 condition or the second condition requires that the evil effects be not intended. What does it mean? It means that the reason of this is that if the evil be directly intended, the act would be done for the sake of evil, and this is forbidden directly by the moral law. Oh, that's correct. So sabi nga dito, the second condition requires that the evil effects be not intended. So if your evil doings is intended, basically you are doing evilness. So basically this is against the law. Okay? So dapat the evil effect is not intended. For example, in involuntary direct act, you are not intended to do the action. So meaning to say, even if it's evil, even if the impact of it is evil, basta not intended or hindi mo sinasadya, because that's involuntary act. Pero if you're trying to understand the voluntariness of yours, meaning to say you are volunteer to do the action which is evilness, that is against the law. Okay, that you can be punished if you will done that one, if you will do that one. Okay, so that is the two condition in moral principle. So now let's move forward to the factors that lessen accountability. So since responsibility depends on the voluntariness present in an act, we must inquire into the factors which affect voluntariness in an action. These are namely concupiscence, fear, and violence. Okay, let's discuss first what is ignorance. Ignorance is the absence of intellectual knowledge, meaning to say you did not know what is the situation all about. You are clueless. We can distinguish ignorance by vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance can be stated or can be dispelled or overcome by any amount of diligence. What does it mean? Meaning to say, if we're trying to identify or explain vincible ignorance, it means when we say it can be dispelled or overcome by any amount of diligence. When we say diligence, kasi care to required. So meaning to say the attention or care to required, or there's a care or concern. So to explain it further, vincible ignorance does not destroy or remove voluntariness nor responsibility. This is an act where still voluntary and the agent is still responsible for them. When we say agent, the individual. For example, a Davaoenyo or a Davao resident who actually violated traffic laws, not knowing of such laws before, would still be responsible for his act because his ignorance is vincible. Why? Because in this example, you are a Davao resident. You are actually living in Davao City. The only problem is you did not know the rules. So that's the problem. So meaning to say, even if the act is voluntary because you did not know the rules and regulation in the society, still you violated what? Vincible ignorance. Still you are responsible to your act kasi you are living in Davao. And if you are living in Davao, you are living in the certain a certain country or place, you are required and you are responsible to know the rules and regulation. So that is vincible ignorance. While invincible ignorance cannot be overcome by any amount of diligence or effort, because under the circumstances, it is impossible for one to know. What does it mean? Meaning to say, when we say invincible ignorance, there's an excuse or relieves with the individual or the agent of the responsibility. What does it mean? When you act invincible ignorance, therefore, it is not voluntary, the individual is not held responsible for them. For example, a Bagobo who had been living all his life in the mountains and who happened to come to Davao for the first time, and violated traffic laws could not be held responsible for violating the law. Why? There's no responsibility of it. Bakit? Because that Bagobo person is not living in Davao. That Bagobo person go to Davao for the first time. So, he or she is not accountable to the action because hindi niya alam ang rules and regulation. Hence, if we're trying to compare it to the person which actually living in Davao, they are accountable and responsible because living in a certain country, you are required to know the rules and regulation. So, that is the difference between vincible and invincible ignorance. Next, we have concupiscence. Concupiscence is basically in English technically called passion. Okay? What does it mean? It means that passion affects the voluntariness of an action. For a man acting under the influence of passion would not be acting perfectly of his own free volition. A man in a fit of anger, for instance, is liable to do acts which otherwise he would not do in his right senses. Passions. Okay? Passions. So that is actually in English term with the term concupiscence. Basically, okay, that's it. Yun na nga. So, meaning to say, if you are acting or influenced by the word passion, you are not acting perfectly of your own free volition. So, meaning to say, if you are anger, you are now in the blank state. So, kapag anger ka or nagagalit ka, ano ang nangyayari ang resulta? magiging pangit or evil ang resulta. Kaya nga in the story, short story Lisa and Salik, or the crocodile story, before you act something, you have to be what? Relax and calm. Why? Because if you are in the boost of angerness, your decision will not lead to what? Goodness. It will lead only to badness. So that's what concupiscent mean. We can actually identify we can actually identify concupiscent by the means of antecedent and consequent concupiscent. When we say antecedent concupiscent, it is lessened but does not remove voluntariness and responsibility. Meaning to say, when we say antecedent concupiscent, without will. Okay? No, there's no consent at all. Then when we say consequent concupiscent, it's neither lessen nor destroys responsibility. Meaning to say, it arises by the will or by the consent of the person. Okay? So that is the concupiscent. So now let's move forward to fear and violence. When we say fear and violence, it is actually a negative emotional response to the situation that is perceived to be threatening. Okay? So meaning to say, when we act because of fear, our will is dragged along, so to say, and so its freedom is restricted and responsibility is diminished correspondingly. So great fear sometimes exempts a person from acts enjoined by positive law. Meaning to say, if we are actually feeling fear, that's the time that we can lessen our we can lessen some evilness or doing some evil. Kasi kapag natatakot ka, paminsan hindi mo nagagawin kung anong for example, hindi mo nagagawin yung aspect, or hindi mo nagagawin yung thing or yung sa situation mo. So kapag natatakot ka, pag nangungunahan ka ng takot, hindi mo na nagagawa yung mga gawain or yung mga gusto mong gawin. So that's why it tell na kapag takot ka, malilesen yung accountability mo sa law. Pero if you are not fear, the violence will arise. So, violence is an impulse from without tending to force the agent to act against this will. So, meaning to say, violence is not intended the person to, or not intending to force the agent. You know already that you are doing, you know with your will that you are doing violence. So, yun na nga, pag hindi ka takot, magagawa mo kahit ano. Pero pag takot ka, hindi mo magagawa kahit simpleng bagay lang, di ba? Because you have this so-called fear. So, that is the relationship between fear and violence. And if we're trying to go with the principle of coercion, so we have likely can explain it by two sides. We have active and passive principle of violence. Okay? What does it mean? So, what does the principle mean? So let's say passive violence or passive principle of violence. This is actually the conscious ignoring of physical and psychological and emotional needs of a person. So what do you mean by conscious? You are aware enough what you are doing, ignoring if the impact of it is physically or psychologically. And what is a good example of it? So, good example is the conscious of failure to ensure the safety of the someone under one's care, or the failure to ensure the development of well-being of someone under one's care is a good example of passive violence. Okay? Because you are not conscious enough, or you are not conscious enough, or you are not aware, and the impact of it is ignoring the physical and psychological needs of the individual that you are interacting with, or the individual that you are actually caring. So while active principle violence or active principle violence is very in contrast to passive principle violence. Why? While active violence involves an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill to people in confined and populated area, or when we say active, you are intended to do the action, while in passive you are not intended to do the action. Okay, you are not planning to do the action. That's why it's called passive. So that is the difference between passive and active violence. Now let's move forward to violence and habit. What does it mean? So the principle of passive violence can be stated briefly and is self-explanatory. Acts done owing to violence. So if the acts one does because one is forced against his will to do, that is violence. Are not voluntary provided that due resistance is made. Consequently, the doer is not morally responsible for doing such act. Okay? Meaning to say, if we're trying to figure out or explain what is violence and habit, it somewhat may explains the passive violence. Okay? Because if we're trying to explain what is violence, it is actually a behavior involving physical force intended to hurt or to damage or kill someone or something. That is violence. Why? The violence can be a habit. So let's define first what is habit. Usual way of behaving. So violence can be a habit if you're intending to do that kind of action. If you are voluntarily doing that action, that governs what? Habit of being violence. So I think that explains the lesson 2, which is the fundamental concept of morality. If you want to ask questions, clarifications with regards to the video lessons, you can literally ask me through or tomorrow. No. You can actually literally ask me next week in our discussion. Okay, face to face discussion. So thank you so much. Bye everyone.